Guai was famous in her home province for one thing, her mind. A gifted poet from Fengyang, she was drafted into the harem of the Ming emperor specifically because of her literary reputation. She arrived at the Forbidden City expecting, at minimum, a life. She got 20 days. In those 20 days, she never once met the emperor, never spoke to him, never entered the same room as him. And when the emperor died suddenly, Guai, a woman he had never laid eyes on, was selected to die alongside him. She knew what was coming. On the final night, she used her one extraordinary gift to compose a poem, apologizing to her parents for the unfilial act of dying before them, and cursing the walls that had swallowed her whole. The next morning, a silk noose was fitted around her neck. She had been in the palace for 20 days. She had never seen the emperor's face. The killing of Guai was a product of the Ming dynasty's most barbaric tradition, one this story will return to. But the machinery that made her death possible, the system that inducted thousands of women and then decided most of them didn't matter, operated in some form across every dynasty that maintained an imperial harem. The economics of that system, the stipends, the rations, the survival calculus assigned to every rank, is its own story, and one we've covered in full. What matters here is where a woman landed when the sorting was finished. A woman placed in the Qing dynasty's lowest rank, second-class attendant, received 30 taels of silver per year, the exact salary of the empire's lowest-ranking civilian clerk. Her daily food consisted of stale rice, 1.5 caddies of pork, 2 caddies of seasonal vegetables, and 0 eggs, while chicken, duck, white flour, and sugar were reserved entirely for higher ranks. She didn't have her own palace. She lived communally in a cramped side hall, furnished with tin spittoons and brass candlesticks, while the empress, a few courtyards away, received 10 eggs a day and ate from solid gold. This was not a punishment. This was the default condition for any woman whose name the emperor had never learned. Here's the thing, she couldn't leave. Imperial law bound her to permanent celibacy, forbade contact with the outside world, and required her to remain within the palace walls until either she or the emperor died. From the day she passed through the gates, her family was forbidden from visiting. A daughter sent to the imperial draft was functionally lost to her parents for life. And if the emperor never turned over her name tablet during the nightly selection, for most women at the bottom ranks, he never did. This side hall would be the entirety of her existence. In palace dramas like Empresses in the Palace, low-ranking attendants orchestrate elaborate poisoning schemes and forge dangerous alliances. The historical record tells a different story. A woman surviving on 30 taels couldn't afford to bribe a eunuch for hot water, let alone procure the rare ingredients needed for the conspiracies dramatized on screen. The true experience of being unchosen was not intrigue. It was a silence so total it bordered on sensory deprivation. Without imperial visits, the courtyards of the Forgotten were empty. No officials came. No ceremonies were performed. The only sounds were brooms on stone, the distant strike of the night watchman's clapper, and the barking of lapdogs these women kept for the simple comfort of hearing another heartbeat. Court records note that at one point, over 100 dogs and cats were kept by low-ranking consorts, not as status symbols, but as companions against the crushing weight of decades with nothing to do and no one to speak to survive the gap between their stipends and the cost of basic needs. Hot water, edible food, breathable air in winter. These women turned their embroidery into currency. They stitched shoes, pouches, and clothing in dim rooms, then paid eunuchs to smuggle the goods out and sell them in Beijing's public markets. The eunuchs skimmed heavily, but this clandestine trade was the only mechanism by which a forgotten woman could afford the charcoal required to survive a Beijing winter. Put it this way, the Forbidden City was the wealthiest compound on Earth, and the women inside it were running a sweatshop to stay alive. Winter tested them hardest. A second-class attendant received 10 caddies of cheap charcoal per day, fuel that burned poorly and filled her cramped room with choking, acrid smoke that stained the walls and scarred her lungs across years of continuous exposure. A few hundred meters away, The emperor and his favorites burned premium smokeless charcoal in well-heated halls. A woman who entered the palace at 14 and remained unchosen at 60 had breathed that smoke through 46 Beijing winters in a room she could never leave. When the emperor died, the unchosen woman's situation didn't improve. It solidified. During the Qing dynasty, all surviving consorts were permanently relocated to the western section of the Forbidden City, primarily the Shoukang, over 8,000 square meters of grand architecture where they spent their remaining decades belonging to a court that no longer existed, entirely cut off from the new emperor's reign. The longest documented residency there lasted 42 years. Low-ranking widows were not automatically elevated. A second-class attendant who had never borne children did not suddenly become a dowager anything. She kept her minimal rank, her minimal rations, and her minimal existence, with even less reason for anyone to acknowledge she was alive. And when the end finally came, she was not allowed to die in her own bed. The moment a low-ranking consort fell terminally ill, eunuchs were dispatched to move her out of the central palaces to a facility near the northeastern edge of the complex called the Jiansuo. The palace classified the impending death of a low-status woman as spiritual contamination that could threaten the emperor's health and the dynasty's fortune. So the dying woman was loaded onto a cart, wheeled through the back alleys, and deposited in a walled compound of roughly 3,800 square meters, built with deliberately compressed architecture, narrow wooden brackets, flat proportions, green glazed tiles instead of imperial yellow. Every structural detail signaling that the woman inside was architecturally irrelevant. Think about what that means. She was dying, and the palace's primary concern was that her death might contaminate the air. She died there. Her body was coffined and transported to the concubine mausoleum, where she was buried in a small uniform earthen mound in the back rows, sharing cramped ground with dozens of other women the dynasty had consumed. The mausoleum at the Eastern Qing tombs contains 49 burial mounds arranged in 7 strict rows, and the unchosen were relegated to the final 3. No grand steles, no spirit paths, no individual memorial halls. The women in the front rows left names. The women in the back left ledger entries. The case of Kui Changzai reveals what that erasure looked like up close. A low-ranking first-class attendant under Qianlong. She lived in obscurity and died in 1756. During her mandatory posthumous rites, the tea officials responsible for the ceremony didn't bother setting up a proper altar table. They placed her ceremonial food offerings directly on the dirty floor. The officials were eventually whipped for the breach, but the punishment was for violating protocol, not for disrespecting a person. Her funeral cakes ended up on the ground. That was the dynasty's final opinion of her life. Everything described so far operated within the Qing system, a framework that, for all its cruelty, had at least abolished the practice of killing unchosen women outright. Earlier dynasties were not so restrained. In the Tang dynasty, when an emperor died, his unchosen consorts were removed from the palace, their heads forcibly shaved, and sent to state-sponsored Buddhist convents to live as celibate nuns for the rest of their lives. Tang poets preserved what the court records erased. The white-haired palace women who entered the harem at 16 and lived into their 60s without ever being summoned, their beautiful faces fading behind convent walls. Wu Zetian, before she became the only female emperor in Chinese history, was nearly one of them, a low-ranking consort shaved and exiled to the Ganye Temple after Emperor Taizong's death. Only an illicit connection with the dead emperor's son saved her from decades of silent devotion to a man who had ignored her. In the Song dynasty, the tools were administrative rather than religious, but equally final. Han Cairen, a low-ranking consort to Emperor Zedong, was accused by the Empress Dowager of failing to properly care for the emperor during his illness. She was stripped of her rank and branded with the non-title of Red Scarf, a designation for low-class women repurposed here as a mark of total social erasure. She was then banished to guard the emperor's tomb for the rest of her life, performing daily rituals for a corpse in the shadow of a burial mound, cut off from every person she had ever known. Now, the early Ming dynasty dispensed with exile altogether. The founding Ming emperors revived an ancient practice called xunzang, the state-mandated killing of concubines to serve the dead emperor in the afterlife. The women selected were overwhelmingly childless, low-ranking, and without powerful families, chosen precisely because nobody would object. The practice consumed over 40 women at the founding emperor's funeral alone. When the Yongle emperor died in 1424, over 30 more were gathered in a ceremonial hall and served a final lavish feast. Small wooden stools had been placed beneath the ceiling beams. Silk ropes hung above each one. Among the condemned was Lady Han, a tribute concubine sent from the Korean peninsula. As the noose was fitted around her neck, she turned to her Korean maidservant and screamed, "Mother, I am going! Mother, I am going!" The stools were kicked away. This account survives not because Chinese court historians recorded it, they sanitized the event, but because the Korean maids who witnessed it were eventually repatriated and testified before the Korean court. The families of the murdered women received hereditary military titles and were labeled households of women facing heaven, a reward designed to buy their silence. It was this same practice that claimed Guo Ai, the poet from the opening of this story, at the Xuande emperor's funeral, just 11 years later. The killings ended only in 1464, when the dying Ming Yingzong, a man who had himself been held captive by the Mongols and understood helplessness, dictated his final will. Among his last commands, do not use concubines for sacrifice. The officials recording the edict wept openly. The mass hanging stopped. The system that classified unchosen women as property, to be stored, transferred, or discarded as the state required, continued for another 4.5 centuries. When the Ming dynasty itself collapsed in 1644, over 200 of these women confined so long they did not know the geography of their own capital threw themselves into the imperial moat. Others fled through the gates and stopped strangers to ask directions to hometowns they hadn't seen since childhood. Whatever lives they had carried into the palace had dissolved decades before the palace itself fell. Not every unchosen woman was consumed by the machine. One survived by turning the system's fundamental indifference into a shield. Cheng Wanyin, known posthumously as Wan Guifei, was a Han Chinese woman given to the Qianlong Emperor when he was still a prince. She was thoroughly ignored. She bore no children, held the low rank of concubine for nearly 5 decades, and survived on minimal rations while the inner court's political bloodletting consumed the ambitious women around her. She never fought for favor. She avoided every factional dispute and drew no attention in any direction. Because she posed no threat to anyone, nobody bothered to destroy her. She outlived the empresses, the favored consorts, and Qianlong himself. The succeeding emperor granted her a posthumous promotion to Dowager Noble Consort, not for any service to the dynasty, but for the simple fact that she was the last one breathing. She died peacefully in her bed at 92 years old. In a court where ambition was lethal, her total irrelevance became the strongest armor available. They entered the Forbidden City as girls, 14, 15 years old, and the system decided before they arrived that most of them would never matter. The unchosen spent their lives in smoke-filled rooms, selling embroidery through smuggling networks and keeping lapdogs to fill the silence. That was the standard output. Decades of quiet, then funeral cakes on the floor. But at least the system left them alone. The women the emperor did notice, the ones whose tablets were turned, whose names he spoke aloud, entered a different kind of danger. Favor in the imperial harem could vanish in a single night, and every woman who rose became a target for every woman above her.